Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to do a bit of a reflection for you. It was probably like a month ago, maybe even 2 months ago, I noticed on Goodreads that I was getting close to having listened to 100 audiobooks in my lifetime. I have a separate list that I created, and I would just tag any book that I listened to on audio to add it to that list. And so I thought, it might be interesting to do a video about it when I reached 100, and I did that pretty recently, obviously. And then I was feeling very motivated last week, and I went through and wrote up an outline for this video about a few different things that I wanted to talk about. One of them being just reflecting on my audiobook journey. I wanted to do audiobook superlatives. I wanted to talk about some specific audiobooks that I really enjoyed, and then even some general listening experiences that I have, and then sort of a general wrap up. So if that's something that sounds interesting to you, please stick around. I imagine this will be a little bit of a longer video, so I would encourage you to get a drink and a snack if you would like to hear me go on and on about audiobooks for a little bit. One of the things that I learned when I was reviewing my list, going back through all the books I've read, I've realized I had 2 books marked as read that I had never tagged as audiobook reads. So it's actually, as of the filming of this video, 102 audiobooks that I've listened to, at least in my lifetime. So not quite as nice as that round 100, but 102 is a round number as well, so it's not too bad. So I wanted to start with just reflecting on my audiobook journey. I have actually been listening to books for a long time, since I was little. My mom, this is definitely her influence, she would have a 45-ish minute commute one way, and then another 45 minutes coming back from work when I was younger. And one of the things that she started doing was borrowing books on tape, because they were on tape back then, from the library or from whoever, and listening to them. And I feel like that was a little bit of an influence. Eventually those books on tape became books on CD, and we would sometimes listen in the car with her, depending on where we were going. And I know she even listened to some of the Harry Potter books that way. So she was a big proponent of books on tape, as she still sometimes refers to them. And for me, the first real standout memory that I have of listening to an audiobook was, I think I was in 7th grade. I had my CD player in my lap. I was riding the bus to school, and I was listening to The Da Vinci Code because my mom had listened to it and she had really enjoyed it. This was when the book was blowing up. Like, it was a phenomenon, this book. And so I also wanted to listen to it because it had an interesting mix of history and adventure. And so I have a very specific memory in my mind of being on the bus and just being sucked into this story, like staring out the window. I even remember where we were on the route to school. So that was probably the first time that an audiobook really made me feel something. It wasn't just something that we listened to in the car. It was like, I wanted to listen to this every day to and from school. From there, it was sort of sporadic here and there. Pick up an audiobook, maybe if we were driving somewhere, going on a long drive to visit grandma, we would pick up an audiobook, and my sister, my mom, and I would listen in the car. But I'd say in 2011, I had a little bit of a spike of interest again. I ended up listening to the entire Percy Jackson series on audiobook because it was just an easy way that I had access to it. It was late 2011. I remember I was in my 2nd year of university, so I was 19. Percy Jackson is aimed at a slightly younger audience, so I wasn't sucked into those stories like some other people were, but I do remember I did listen to all 5 of them on audio. And then I, had a few others here and there, but I really started listening to audiobooks again in 2017. And that's when I really started to utilize my library and borrowed books from people on their Audible accounts and whatnot. So that's, ever since then, 2017 to now, is when I've really been getting back into the audiobook listening. Even more recently, I would say, I've started doing that thing where sometimes you start a book physically and you realize it's just not working for you, and you pick up the audiobook instead. I know a lot of people on BookTube do that now, but I feel like that's not something that was particularly common, at least when BookTube started. But so I'm maybe a bit of a late adopter in that method, but I really find it helpful sometimes to drop the physical book, pick up the audiobook, and it's great to have because you can listen to it while you're doing other things around the house. So that's sort of a very small, timeline of where we are today. I'd say most of the time these days I do have an audiobook going. Sometimes I will pause audiobooks and listen to some podcasts, but generally I have an audiobook going along with one or two other physical books. Now moving on to Audiobook Superlatives. I thought it might be fun to dive into this a little bit, and it would give me a chance to talk about a few of the audiobooks that I have listened to in my lifetime. I wanted to start with the first audiobook that I ever listened to, and then also, the opposite of that, my most recent one that I've completed. In terms of my first audiobook, I don't know for sure. Like I mentioned, I've been listening to them since I was little, so I don't have an exact mental timeline of when that would be. This was long before Goodreads, but I do have memories of listening to Aragon by Christopher Paolini on tape. So it was a book on tape from the library. So this was, way back in the day. I don't know exactly when that book was published. It was published in 2002, so it was probably around that time that I listened to it. I remember being in my room and sitting on my bed and just listening to the story. And so that's possibly one of my first ones. I also remember listening to at least part of, if not all of, The Golden Compass, which is the first book in the His Dark Material series. I also remember listening to that one on tape at some point, but I'm not sure which one came first. So one of those two is probably the first book that I ever actually listened to purposefully on my own. In terms of my most recent book, I recently finished Carrie Soto Is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. So this was my 100th book. I thought it was going to be my 100th. It was actually my 102nd once I went back and did a deep dive. This is another popular book, just more recently very popular because it was published last year. And this is my fourth Taylor Jenkins Reid book, and it focuses on Carrie Soto, who's a tennis player, and who knew that tennis could be so interesting in this sort of book? So Aragon, about dragons, fantasy, that was what I was into when I was younger. Nowadays, not so into fantasy. I'm feeling the tug though to get back into it a bit, but Carrie Soto Is Back is much more a reflection of something I would listen to these days as sort of a contemporary, fun, fast read. Now on to the shortest and longest audiobooks that I've ever listened to. The shortest one is Christmas Eve 1914. It is 1 hour and 13 minutes long. It's a book by Charles Olivier, or at least a story by Charles Olivier. I think it was available on Audible as one of those free downloads, and I listened to it on Christmas Eve back in 2021. Thank you, Goodreads, for documenting that. And so, it's just about the point in World War I where they had sort of a Christmas truce and the two sides stopped fighting each other in recognition of Christmas. And it is a full cast, so there's sound effects and everything, but I just thought it would be cool to listen to on Christmas Eve. Didn't really stick with me too much, but it's an hour and 13 minutes. It was just something fun to do on Christmas Eve. The longest book that I've ever listened to is War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, coming in at 61 hours and 6 minutes. If I were to do this nowadays, I just wouldn't. The only reason I really listened to this is because of Audible credits. I was determined to get the most bang for my buck. I listened to this in my first year of university, so I definitely didn't have the income to be spending on audiobooks. This was another one of those points where it was utilizing the Audible account that my mom had. And so I was I'm gonna get the most bang for my buck. What's the longest audiobook I can get with 1 or 2 credits? War and Peace. So I did listen to it all. Could I tell you anything about it? No, not really. It didn't stick with me at all. This was before I started using Goodreads, right before I got into using Goodreads, and I feel that has helped shape my reading a bit and make some better decisions for myself in terms of what I'm actually going to spend my time on. Whereas back then it was sort of whatever I have available to me is what I will read. And so that's how I ended up listening to War and Peace. In terms of oldest versus newest, this is based on publication date. So the oldest is also War and Peace, which was published in 1867. But because I've already mentioned that one, I figured I would share the next oldest book that I've listened to on audio, and that is Phantom of the Opera, which was published in 1909. This one I do remember a little bit more of. It was much shorter. I think I also listened to it maybe in my first year of university, and that story I'm more familiar with. I've seen the movie, I've seen the stage production, and so that was much better use of my time. The newest book is Exiles by Jane Harper. This book was published on September 20th, 2022. I really enjoy Jane Harper's books. This is the third book in a series that focuses on a particular character. It's a murder mystery set in Australia, and so I was very excited when I knew this book was coming out, once it was available here and the audiobook was available. I had been sort of saving it for myself, so that's actually another book that I have very recently finished. I think Exiles was the book that I finished right before Carrie Soto was back. I next have highest rated and lowest rated. My highest rated listen is The Only Plane in the Sky, and this is by Garrett M. Graff. This is oral history of 9/11. It has a full cast. It's a very intense story, and it has a 4.72 on Goodreads. And then the lowest rated on Goodreads that I've listened to is The Geographer's Library, which I'm definitely gonna have to look up this author. I think this was another one where it was before I actually used Goodreads. Yeah, so it's by John Fassman. It doesn't have a date read, so like I said, it was before I was using Goodreads, but that has a 3.03, which is not great, not great. I don't remember anything about the book either. And then my most popular and least popular, so this is just based on the number of ratings that the book has. Most popular, Angels and Demons by Dan Brown, which is interesting that it actually has more than the Da Vinci Code, considering how much more popular the Da Vinci Code was at the time that, you know, he was really blowing up publishing. Angels and Demons has 3.1 million ratings, which is, that's a lot of ratings. The least popular is actually Chatter by Patrick Radden Keefe. I listened to this also before Goodreads was a thing, and I didn't know that I would then go on to read a bunch of other Patrick Radden Keefe books throughout my life. But this was another audiobook that I was probably in high school when I listened to it, and I remember really enjoying the story. It's uncovering the Echelon surveillance network and the secret world of global eavesdropping. And I think it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. I gave it 4 stars when I rated it on Goodreads way back in the day. I don't know if I would feel the same way if I listened to it now. But clearly when I did join Goodreads in 2011, I was much closer to having listened to this book, so I could remember how it made me feel. But it would be interesting to listen to it again and see if it hits me in the same way. But yeah, it's clearly not very popular because it has 563 ratings. That's it. Now moving on to some specific outstanding books. 2 of these, the experience was absolutely enhanced by listening to them on audio. But one of them is one of my favorite books that I've ever read, and I didn't think it wasn't anything special in terms of the production. It was just the book itself was so good. The first one I have to mention is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah. This book is probably the book I would recommend to somebody who wants to get into audiobooks or hasn't read it and enjoys listening to audiobooks. This is a memoir that Trevor Noah narrates himself. And if any of you know Trevor Noah, you'll know that he's very good at doing accents and voices. And because it's his own story, he is obviously very close to the source material. And it is just such a good listen to hear him doing the voices, talking about the different languages that he can speak, talking about growing up in South Africa during apartheid and what that meant for his life. And so even though I only gave the book 4 stars when I listened to it, it's one of those books that's really stuck with me through all these years. I listened to it in 2017 and I still think about it all the time. The second book on this list is actually one that I've already mentioned, and that is The Only Plane in the Sky. I listened to this last year, so 2022, and it was incredibly impactful. As I mentioned, it is a full cast, and some of the people that are narrating are the people that are written about in the book. It takes a little bit to get used to because you are jumping. It does follow the day chronologically of everything that happened on 9/11, but you are constantly jumping between people. So it took me a little bit to settle into that sort of experience where there might be one paragraph, then you're jumping to another one, and you're seeing things from all these different perspectives. But what really got me is that they did have actual audio from the day. So the planes that were hijacked, they did have some of the actual communications and messages that they were sending. It gives you goosebumps. It makes you feel a little sweaty too, because yeah, it's an intense listen, but I had never experienced something on that level before. And so it's stuck with me, and it's been a little over a year, I think, since I listened to it, but I know it's going to stick with me for a really long time. The third book that I want to call out specifically, and the last one in this section, is Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. This is the one that doesn't have a particularly special audiobook experience, but it is about medicine and what matters in the end. So end of life care, hospice, that sort of thing. I have since figured out that I really enjoy medical nonfiction. This was kind of before I knew that, because I listened to this in 2018. So it's been a few years now. I've had more time to reflect. But it was a powerful listen, and I was listening to it on public transportation. This was me going to work, sometimes having to get on 3 different buses, and so I got through a bunch of audiobooks during that time. This was one of them. But like jumping from 3 different buses, public transportation, you're jammed in with people and everything, and I still enjoyed this audiobook to the point where it is on my favorites list. I would be interested to reread it as a physical book and see how it feels in that way, but as an audiobook, oh, it was so good. And to still have it stick with you so thoroughly despite all of these other distractions, I think just speaks to how powerful it is. Now I want to mention some specific listening experiences. So not individual books, but just 2 different instances where listening to these books and getting into these stories it's just been a great joy, really. So the first is Jane Harper's books. I mentioned Exiles, and how Jane Harper writes murder mystery books. They're all set in different parts of Australia. And I just happened to read The Dry, which is the first one in the Aaron Falk series. So there's 3 books that follow a specific character, and then there's 2 standalone books. Because these books are set in Australia, there's an Australian narrator. His name is Steve Shanahan, and he narrates all of Jane Harper's books so far, and I love his voice. It is so nice to listen to. It just really helps get you into the story. If I was reading the physical book, I wouldn't be hearing it in an Australian accent in my head, right? So to hear it on audio just really elevates the experience. After listening to The Dry and enjoying it so much, the second book, Force of Nature, was also already out. So I went right into listening to that one, more or less, and also really enjoyed it. So ever since then, I have now listened to all 5 of Jane Harper's published works on audiobook, specifically because I love hearing Steve Shanahan's Australian accent and just the settings. They come alive. Like, Jane Harper knows how to make you feel like you're there. Just such a great listening experience, which is why I had to mention it. The other really impactful listening experience I have to mention is the Grisha trilogy, Six of Crows duology, and then the King of Scars duology by Leigh Bardugo. I happened to listen to the first Grisha book on audio. I borrowed it from my friend Roxy at her urging, and although I wouldn't say that the books are like top-notch or anything, it was cool to hear all these new words and names being read to me, and it became one of those instances where I had never seen like these names written down. I'd only ever heard them. So sometimes you read the physical book and you're like, okay, I know how this is spelled, but I don't know how I'm actually supposed to pronounce this, especially with fantasy novels, right? Whereas this, I was like, oh, I know exactly how to pronounce all these things, but I have no idea how they're spelled. So I'd see them written out somewhere, whether, you know, online somewhere, and I'd be like, oh, that's that word. Okay, interesting. But anyway, I find the whole Grishaverse world really cool. Like there are, like the Grisha trilogies, okay. Six of Crows, a little bit better. King of Scars, pretty good too. But I think the entire world that she created, I really enjoyed that's what keeps bringing me back to the books, and to hear them on audio, like after listening to the first 5 books that she had published in that world, when the King of Scars books were being released, I was like, well, I have to listen to them on audio because that's the only way I've ever been in this world. And so that is also why I just needed to mention that as a specific cool experience. To sort of shift to the wrap-up portion of this, some of these takeaways, now that I've done all my reflecting that I want to do, I have to say that I will definitely keep listening to audiobooks. I find it a really great way to get reading in when you need to be cleaning, organizing, exercising. Like there was a time in my life where I could only exercise with listening to music because I needed that motivation. Whereas now I listen to audiobooks and podcasts all the time when I'm running. And if you have a really good audiobook going, it can completely distract you from the physical pain that you might be feeling when you're exercising. So yes, absolutely will keep listening. It's such a great way to utilize your time more efficiently. I also just want to shout out my mom, first of all, for being a books on tape girl and then influencing me to listen to stories that way, and for also letting me mooch off her Audible for a long time. Also my friend Roxy, who I mentioned, who got me into the Grisha trilogy because I also mooched off her Audible. And then my sister, because I have also mooched off her Audible at some point in my life. So yeah, I've never actually had an Audible account. I have just mooched off of other people. So I have to say thanks to them for letting me do that. Nowadays, I listen to a lot of my audiobooks from the library. I've been able to get a lot of books from there. So shout out to my local public library for giving me access to lots and lots of titles for free. Now I turn to you, the viewer, and ask, is there a specific audiobook listening experience that you've had that you really enjoyed? Are there certain narrators that you really love, certain series that you just have to listen to them on audio? Definitely let me know. And I also would really like to know if you have ever read a book physically and then reread it as an audio, or maybe vice versa. I'm just curious to know if you got different things out of it. I've never actually done that myself. I've only ever switched part way through a book because I knew it was going to be better enjoyed one way or the other. So yeah, love to hear what you have to say. And if you want to share anything else about audiobooks, we can just talk about how great they are as a concept, as a thing. You can also leave those comments down below. As always, all of our links are in the down bar. You can go check those out if you feel so inclined. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you later.